Hi, nice to meet you, and thank you so much for having me here. So my name is Fern, Remedi-Brown, and just to give you a little bit of background, so I have lived in Malden for many years. I have two daughters who went through Malden Public Schools, and so I have told this story about my father's life since our older daughter, who is now 25, was in 12th grade. And I was asked to do it because at that time they were reading Number the Stars in 6th grade, and they wanted to have some context. And because I lived here and my father had been through the Holocaust, they wanted me to speak. So my father's story, I feel like very proud about him. He came to this country without, and I know this is true for a lot of people here, without English, without any family, without any high school education, and without any money. And from that, he became a professor at the university level, which I feel is like an incredible accomplishment. He did a lot of things in his life which were amazing, and he knew 4 languages. He wrote books, and from coming into this country without having had that the education, I feel is like an amazing thing. But he didn't do it alone. So there were a number of factors that were important, and the main one that I feel is important to share is that my father, even though he had a really rough from his high school years on, when he was 16, he and his family were separated, and he had to do harsh labor without almost any food, and he was moved from place to place. And that was over a period of a year, and he only had on springtime clothes, and he had to do this through the winter too. So it was a really horrible experience, and he almost lost his life. And actually, which you may have seen, that his father actually did die in his arms. And his mother was taken. His mother and the rest of his family were taken, and they went on cattle cars to Auschwitz. So that's my grandmother, whose story I'm sharing. That's why it's so important to me. And the other thing is that in the Jewish tradition, we're named after somebody who passed on, so I have her name. So I feel like it's important for me to continue the legacy. And I started to want to tell his story after he passed away in 2010. And the other thing is that how important it is to recognize one another's humanity, because if not for one person who did that for my father, I wouldn't be here speaking with you today. Mm-hmm. So those are like key things that I feel are really important to share.
Who was Malden Brown, and why is it important to share his story?
So when he was a little boy, he was born in the year 1928. So when he was 10 years old in 1938, that's when things started to change. He lived in Hungary, which is in Eastern Europe. So actually, Hungary was the last country during the Holocaust to be taken by the German Nazis. And so the Jews thought were safe because the two countries were allies with each other. But it wasn't to be the case, as we know. So 70% of the Jews in Hungary were murdered, and my family was among them. And my father lost all of his family except for 3 cousins. So, but he went on after he came to the United States. He came in when he was 21 years old, and since he didn't know English and he didn't have money, he worked as cleaning in a diner. And then I'll tell you a little story. I don't know how much I can go into it, but this story is like really representative. So there was another person who was working in that same diner who worked in New York City in the summers, and in the winters went to Florida. And that's where my father arrived first when he came to the United States, because he had an uncle who sponsored him to come here. And he could only stay with him for 2 weeks, so he had to make his money. And he also happened to have a wife who was not my mom at that time, and an 11-month-old baby, so he definitely had to support them. And so the taxi driver who was working in that restaurant during the wintertime in Florida said to him, "Do you want to work with your hands, or do you want to work with your mind?" And my father really believed in education, and so he said, "I want to work with my mind." And the taxi driver said, "Go to New York City," because that was where he spent the summer, so he knew. And there's a university there called City College of New York. And City College of New York, if you establish, this isn't true anymore, but if you establish residency there, you can go to university for free. And so my father said, "Great, I'm going to do that." And he said, "It's the poor man's Harvard," which that was at the time. So it was like well respected. And so my father did that. When my father went and established his residency for 6 months in New York like he was supposed to, and he went to knock on the door of the dean, and he said, he didn't have a high school diploma when he came to the United States, so he had a GED. So that's not exactly the same thing as a high school diploma, and not recognized by every university. And they said, we don't want you. And he said, "Please let me try." And he kept coming back. So this is like an example. My father was very persistent. He had a lot of resilience. And so they said, "No, sorry, like that's our rule." And finally, like he came back, I don't know how many times. And the assistant to the dean, or the assistant dean, said to him, "I'll give the guy a chance." And he ended up graduating first in his class of 2,000 students, because he studied really hard. So I'm proud of my father.
What was life like in Miskolc? Is that how you say that?
Miskolc.
Miskolc.
Yeah. So
Hungary.
Hungarian words are Hungarian is not like any other language in the world except for Finnish, slightly. Yeah. So anyway, it's pronounced Miskolc. So Miskolc was the second largest city in Hungary, and it had all of, at that time, the modern conveniences. And something that's really important to share about that is when we think about modern conveniences, we think about the internet. And so the internet is key to everything we do. And then when we want to share news, we can just send them, TikTok, whatever, Snap. So there was no such thing as the internet. It had never been even imagined in life. And so because of that, there was no control over the news or sharing it with anybody unless you were friends with them, or it went like rumors. And so any news that they wanted to share had to be shared by the government. So there was a radio and newspaper, and that was pretty much it. And so there were underground things that were happening, but most people didn't have access to any of that. And so the key thing to know is that even though it was modern, much like we enjoy today, but for those standards, the internet was the key component. And when people say, "Well, how did people not know about the Holocaust?" It was because the news came from the government. But so in Miskolc, they had, I didn't call it a subway. It was like on the ground, so it was kind of like the green line, but like the orange line, but above ground. And people worked in all kinds of professions, and so my grandmother, my father's mother, was a school teacher in the elementary school, and my grandfather, my father's father, bought and sold grains. And so a key thing is that in 1938, when my father was 10, laws started to happen in Europe. And the reason for the laws was because the Nazis under Adolf Hitler wanted to eradicate the rights and privileges of the Jews, because if you do things incrementally, people may not notice. So the one thing that really affected my family, my grandfather, was that he no longer could own his own business. So Jews could no longer, at 1938, Jews could no longer own their own businesses. So that was taken from him, and he fortunately got a job working for somebody who wasn't Jewish. But that was one of the key things that was changing. And another thing is that people were segregated. So the Jewish life was at the synagogue, and when people would socialize, they would do it in their own groups, and that was because of safety. So, you know, when I walk down the halls of Malden High and I see the integration, it feels so safe here, but it wasn't safe there to integrate. And so, an example of that was. My father, when he was 15, I think, 14. Oh, no, actually, I think it was 13. So he went to an exam school. There's certain exam schools in Boston too, like Boston Latin, you may have heard. So he went to this exam school, and at that time, all of the schools were segregated by religion, which you can imagine. So there was a Catholic school, which we do have here in Malden, but also there was a Protestant school and there was a Jewish school. We don't have that here in Malden. So the Jewish school in Miskolc only went up to elementary school. And so if they wanted to go to high school, which they call gymnasium, they had to take an exam and see if they got into the Catholic or the Protestant school. And the Catholic school required a higher exam level. And my father was one of 6 Jewish children, boys only, yes, boys only. So there was a lot of segregation. Who was allowed into the Catholic high school. And so he studied very hard to be able to get into that. And another thing that started to change was, so Hitler came up with the idea, which I think is not a novel idea, that if you address the young people, that you can get people on your side. So there was a group called Hitler Youth, and the Hitler Youth, like, it wasn't formalized yet in Hungary, but and especially in Miskolc, because it was not the capital is Budapest, and this is to the north near Slovakia. So nevertheless, there was the undercurrents of that, and so even though it wasn't formalized, it still there was bullying that went on against the Jews. And so my father had a best friend. His name was Tommy. And Tommy and there were 2 things that they did. One was, there's a metaphor that I want to share about. And so when they were in elementary school, it was a Jewish elementary school together, they saw that in the river that was right next door to their elementary school, people would throw kittens in there to drown, because they didn't have the I don't know what you call it, the police who drive around and pick up animals that don't have a home. They didn't have that. They would throw them in there. And I know that that's horrible, and he and the two of them also thought it was horrible, and so they rescued them. That was what they, like, their pastime, to rescue them. So this became a metaphor for actually his life being rescued. So when they were getting bullied, which was later on, like after they were 13, then they would form a group and protect the younger and smaller Jewish children from getting bullied.
What specific changes started happening in Miskolc that signaled danger for Jewish families?
Well, it's like the laws that started to change. And one thing that I was going to share. So when my father went to the Catholic school, there was a Jewish school, but for girls, but it wasn't. I'm trying to think where. I don't know that detail exactly, but he was walking with one of those girls because they were recognizable because they had a uniform. And so some of the bullies would say to him, "Why are you walking with a Jewish girl? Are you a Jew?" So that was the kind of way. So because Jews are not necessarily identifiable, but they could be targeted. And then what changed, of course, is that the Jews had to wear the yellow star. That happened in the 1940s. So then when they wore the star, then they were identifiable. And there were ways that they became identifiable. So another way that was key is in March 1944, my father and my mother, my father and his mother, and all of their aunt and uncles had to go into his grandmother's house. And that was because there was something called a ghetto. So ghetto had a different meaning then than does now. But actually both were created by the government to keep people in their place. So one was for a purpose of economy and race, and back then it was to identify the Jews, but only temporarily, because the intention was to put them into an enclosed area, and then once they made the decision, then they would come out and be selected to go either to work or to Auschwitz. So, and when I say work, it wasn't get a job. It was no pay. I mean, you could liken it to slave labor because they didn't have any money and they didn't get food and they had no choice and they couldn't leave.
So the next question actually is about the Miskolc ghetto. What was it like? What was life like in the Miskolc ghetto from March to June of 1944?
Yes. So I have an interesting anecdote about that. So in the Miskolc ghetto, there was an overcrowding, and then anybody who got sick, everybody got sick. So interestingly, the Miskolc ghetto was in the same location as the Miskolc synagogue. And so they turned the synagogue into a hospital. And the reason they did that is just so people could get treated. I think it was probably more for show than anything else. My father, when he was 13 years old, he had a bar mitzvah, and he got a bicycle for his bar mitzvah. Now today, if you've ever been to a bar mitzvah, they have a huge party, but there was no huge party back then. The only thing that they had was they had to recite from the Jewish Bible, from the Torah, in Hebrew with no vowels. It's not easy to do. And then they drank a glass of wine and they got one present. And there was no big party for them. And so the bicycle was really amazing because he had mobility. So because he had this bicycle when he was 13, then when he was 16, when he went into the ghetto, then he still had this bicycle and he could move around within the ghetto. But because of that, he became a messenger for the hospital, for quote-unquote hospital. And so one day, a doctor came to his grandmother's house and said, I have a request of you. Somehow the doctor knew that his sister, who was pregnant, was next in line to be inquisitioned by the Nazis. And I don't even know what she was going to be inquisitioned for, but he said, I want to protect my sister. And because he was a doctor, he said, I have this pill, and it will slow down her heart rate so that it will be unrecognizable to a layperson unless you have a stethoscope, like a doctor. And so my father was afraid. He didn't want to kill the sister of the doctor, but since this was an adult and my father was 16, and since not only an adult but a doctor, he did it, and so the doctor was forever grateful. And it's an example of the extent that people had to go to survive. Yeah.
What was the miracle miracle that saved Alan Brown's life during the Holocaust?
Oh my goodness, there were actually several miracles. I can think of 4 right now that actually allowed me to be here speaking to you. So the first miracle was after the ghetto was liquidated, which means that the Nazis said, everybody out, and you're going to stand. So if you've ever been to like the Veterans Day or Memorial Day parade, like right in front of Malden High School, they have this bandstand, like tall table. So it wasn't that tall, but the official people were sitting at that, and all the Jews were marched down just in a similar kind of way. And so they asked 2 questions. What's your name and how old are you? That's all they cared about. And I guess they thought it was self-evident what gender they were. None of that was discussed back then. So if they were male and they were 18 years old, then they could go to work. And if they were female, they had no chance at all. So I'm sure you probably have studied about the cattle cars that took them to Auschwitz. Yeah. So they didn't know that because, as I mentioned, there was no access to the media, no Instagram. You didn't have any kind of knowledge about that. And so this guard, who happened to be sitting at the table, spoke both Hungarian, and as I mentioned, not related to any language except Finnish, just barely, and he also spoke German. It was possible that he was a German citizen that relocated, became a citizen in Hungary, so he learned both languages. The guard behind him was a German Nazi, and he didn't speak Hungarian. It was very hard to know. So he had to have this translator person. So he would ask in Hungarian, how old are you? And my father said, I'm 16. And the guard knew, no, not that. So he said, no, you're not. And my father said, yes, I am. This went back a few times, and finally the guard said, do I have to teach you how to lie? And so my father had no idea what this meant, but that was the first miracle that saved his life. And at the same time, he got to be connected with his father because his father was, I don't even know why, I guess because it was clear that his father was of that age, so his father had already gone to the labor camps. And so my father got to reunite with him, which actually, in the study of people who survived the Holocaust, if they had a family member or somebody to care for, it helped to save their life because they had that human element as opposed to being separate.
What was Alan's experience like during the deportations?
So I mean, actually, that's the key thing. Yeah. So when he was deported from his city, so he was separated from his mother, and he didn't know when he would see her again or if he would, and he never did see her again. In fact, so I don't even know, because I can't ask him, if he ever found out. So I did some research at one point after my father died, and I found out from the Holocaust Museum of the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they keep records of everything. So they had, it was not clear to me, but it looked like they had a record of my grandmother. But my father, I saw all the letters that he and also that my brother had written, because my brother lived in D.C., trying to find out information about my grandmother specifically. My grandfather, it was clear because he died in my father's arms in the labor camps, and that's another whole story. But yeah, so being separated from his mom and not knowing when he would be able to or if he would be able to see her again, I think was probably the biggest thing aside from that miracle that happened. Yeah.
What was life like in the camps?
So my father, as part of my presentation, my father has a 10-minute Vimeo, and he tells a little bit about that. 2 key things were that the Nazis used the Jews. The Jews were only a means to an end. So they use them for hard labor, such as digging tank traps for the Russians who were coming from the east. So the Russians were on, I know things have changed like back and forth, but the Russians were on the United States side, as well as England.
Yeah.
So they were the Allied forces. So the Russians were trying to take over, or to win over, or to conquer the German Nazis. And so they dug traps so that the tanks would fall into them. And they also felled trees so that they would, this is like really hard labor. And if you're not eating, that's tough too. So, plus if it's winter and you're wearing spring clothes. So the hard labor was one thing. Another was that the German Nazis, so first it was the Hungarian Nazis, when they were in 6 camps that they went from place to place in northern Hungary along the border with Slovakia. So at first they were just, they were in Hungary, and then they were moved to Austria further west, and when they were there, the German Nazis took over, and it was even harsher. But in one of the camps, they were digging coal for fuel. And so coincidentally, in that same camp, there was a doctor. And the doctor happened to have a special ointment on him. I don't even know how that even happened. So my father got coal inside, or he got a cut and he got coal inside his hand, and he could have lost his hand. The doctor took out the coal and stitched him up and put the ointment. I don't know how this happened, but that was a miracle. That saved my father. But I would say the greatest miracle that happened in the camps was when they were moved finally to Austria, to this little place in the middle of the woods. So actually, they couldn't run anywhere. It didn't have barbed wire or barking dogs. It's not like what you may see in, films. But by this point, I'm going to say everybody was indoctrinated to hate Jews. And so there was nowhere to run to. But so they would have to walk from their barracks, where they were crammed together, and people were dying because they got typhoid, and they got typhoid fever, and they got tuberculosis. And then, of course, that's an infectious disease. Those are infectious diseases, so then others would also get sick and die. And that was part of the Nazis' plan. They wanted to murder as many Jews as possible, but work them to death first. So when they would walk to the fields where they had to pick spinach or something to that effect, and they had to, they passed by 2 things on their way. One was what my father thought was a pharmacy. It was just this one little standalone pharmacy, and the other was a well where people get water. And these become significant. So one night, my father said he realized that his father got typhus fever. He said the dreaded fever of typhus. And so he wanted to help his father, and he took a huge risk going out in the middle of the night and went to ring the bell of this pharmacy, or knock on the door of this pharmacy. And this is a story that my father tells in the video, in the 10-minute Vimeo. So the woman there grabbed him by his dirty jacket, because it was the same jacket that he had been wearing. Like this is now at this point, I think it was January, March. Yeah, I think it was March. So 1 year later, and grabbed him by his dirty jacket and threw him into a room on her right. And she said in German, so fortunately my father had studied German in school. Note to self, always know a second language may help you. So she said in German, "I'll be right back." And then he had no idea, like, what is this? And then she came back and she said, "I had to get rid of the SS guard, the military, not German Nazi, in the other room." Because they would come a lot of times, and it wasn't just a pharmacy, it was a general store. So they would, talk to her and, buy things or whatever. So she was, in fact, a person who would regularly do things to help people. But my father didn't know that. And he took a huge risk, because she could have been a collaborator, which most people were. And the German Nazis would, from time to time, threaten to cut her braids or to close down her store. And she said, well, then I won't give you any more marmalade. Like, she was just really tough. It's like, there's a word in Yiddish, chutzpah, which is like unmitigatable gall. Like, there's no way that you can imagine that.
God.
So, anyway, so she said, here's some bread and here's some medicine to bring your father's fever down. And she said, every day, incredible, when you go out to the fields to work, I'm going to put some food in the snow, like a baked potato or something, and some more medicine in the snow next to the well. And you pick it up and take, like Howie didn't get shot because they would randomly say, this is what we think of a Jewish life, and just shoot somebody. So anyway, he survived that somehow. And so then he tells in the Vimeo that I had to also share the medicine with my father because I also got the fever. Mm-hmm. And so he was very sick, and then as he was being, the German Nazis who were running that camp decided that anybody who couldn't work, they would be shot. But it wasn't just shot on sight, they would make it very...
like drawn out.
What was the word? Like clinical, like they would dig their own grave. Mm-hmm. They would drive them to a place where it's called the killing fields. Well, they call it the hospital, exactly. So they dug their own graves, and then they shot them and they went into them. But so here's another miracle that saved my father's life. The German Nazis heard the Russians coming from the east in the tanks. Like they could hear the tanks coming because they were rumbling, and so they said, "Oh, let's dump them into a ditch on the side of the road," and they drove off, take no prisoners. That was a miracle as well. Like so many things that were miracles that saved my father's life. And actually, another not funny thing is that the Russians then said, well, we're going to take the Hungarian prisoners, but not knowing that these were already prisoners. So they tried to take them when they arrived, so then what happened was one of the people, and I don't even know how this happened, was wearing a Jewish prayer. It's called tefillin. So it's usually wrapped around, is it tefillin or talis? It might have been a talis. Anyway, so something that was obvious, but I do not know how he managed to keep all this amount of time. And so the Russian, so there are Jews who live in Russia, and they were not collaborators with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So one of the Russians who was on this truck or tank said, or I guess it was a truck that followed the tank, and they were trying to gather all of the prisoners onto their truck to take them as their prisoners. And he said, "What is that?" And he said, It's a talis, or it's a tefillin. I use it for praying. I'm Jewish." He said, "I'm Jewish too. Get off the truck. Are there more?" That was another miracle that saved my father's life. I mean, if you can even imagine. So I think that the moral of the story is that if you survive the Holocaust, it was a series of luck. There's a word beshert in Yiddish, which means fate or some kind of destiny or some kind of amazing luck that you've had. So that was that. And so after this, my father said, "I need to get back to Miskolc." It was 100 kilometers, like more than 100 miles. And he walked, because how else could he get there? I'm not going to hitchhike. Everybody hated Jews. So there were a few people. And so actually, after the Russians came, I forgot the important point, is that they were in the ditch, and my father had his father, and he wasn't very old, like maybe in his 40s, but he had typhus and he'd been through so much. So he died in my father's arms. So my father wasn't able to take him, but my father was delirious with fever, and they would like just drink from the cow's milk and eat raw corn in the fields, because what else could they do, and sleep in farmhouses, and then they walked to get back. And he waited there for 6 months to see if anybody would return. And again, no internet, no way to know, like, where are people? And so after 6 months, he said, the anti-Semitism is unbearable. He actually even created a small business to survive. He went back to his parents' house, and the person who was there said, "This is our house now." And they threw out of the house, "Here, you can have this dirty old rotten furniture." And he had a friend, somehow, another miracle, who could fix furniture. And so my father decided, I'm going to fix this furniture and sell it. And then he got more broken furniture and got it fixed and sold it. So he was able to make money. But then the Depression was happening. Is there a Depression in 1945? No. But the currency was so low that he couldn't survive there. Like, people were using tobacco as currency because they didn't have any other way to pay for things. It was just like, it was the only thing that wouldn't change in value. Not that they would smoke it, they would use it to pay for stuff. So because of the Depression, because of the anti-Semitism, and because his family, nobody was coming back, he decided to leave. And he did some. My father was a very, like, chutzpah. He had a lot of crazy ideas. He with the money that he had, he bought a pack of tobacco. He bought a Red Cross blanket from the French Red Cross. I don't know how. And he had somebody make it into an outfit that like looked like a uniform, and he made a false ID to look like the French Red Cross, and then he somehow got to drive a French Red Cross truck. I had a job doing that. And when he went to the borders, he only knew one poem in French, so he would just recite it, but they didn't know any difference. Anyway, so you asked how, when he came back to the United States. So in the interim, he ended up in a displaced persons camp for 2 years. That's where he met the woman who became his wife. She was a nurse, and she was a little bit older than him, and not Jewish. And so when he arrived in the United States, he had an uncle who sponsored him. Everybody had to have someone to sponsor them to come. I mean, even in the United States, there was rampant anti-Semitism, sorry to say. Because even one ship was turned away into oblivion. Some ships went to South and Central America, South America, and that's how there happened to be Jews in South America after the Holocaust. I know less about that story, but at any rate, so he had a sponsor, but he actually, so he didn't have an ID. Not only did he not have education or money or family or what was the other thing? Money, family, or English. He also didn't have an ID because that was, they took him. So what people did back then, so my father came here undocumented. That's the true story. So what people did back then was when someone died, they would take like whatever ID was created for that person. I don't even know how that happened, because why did one person have it and the other didn't? But the story I have is that he took the ID of a dead person. And when he came to the United States, he had to pretend that was his name and his birth date. He pretended that until he retired. Yeah, it was really, crazy. Not the name. The name he changed because he became a naturalized citizen.
So, as a final question, why is it important for future generations to hear and reflect on stories like this, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. I think the main thing that we have to remember is each other's humanity. I think that not knowing one another's humanity, or not acknowledging it, or not embracing it, can lead to genocide. I mean, that's my bottom line that I believe in. And my father taught me how to be resilient, how to stand up for myself, how not to accept injustice, and those are things that I carry with me. So why is it important to know stories like this? I think that it's important to know those, to be able to stand up for yourself, to be able to be there for other people, to be able to hear people's stories, and to be able to know what people have been through, and to say, I'm there for you. I mean, that to me is like so essential. I think that's, yeah. And the fact that my father had somebody who stood up for him. I mean, I never want anyone to put themselves in harm's way. I'm not advocating for that. So if you're a student, then you obviously don't want to put yourself into harm's way if you see something wrong. But it's good to tell somebody who can do something about it. Somebody, a teacher, somebody in authority. There's a word that was coined by Facing History and Ourselves, which is an organization that teaches teachers how to teach about genocide in general. It first started with about the Holocaust, and then it went on to talk about all genocides. And this word is upstander. So the definition is a person who takes action, particularly when the easiest or most acceptable course is to do nothing. Elie Wiesel, whom you probably have heard about, he was a Holocaust survivor and a very notable writer. He says that the opposite of hate is not love. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And so having indifference to one another, I think, is really deeply damaging. Yeah, okay, I think then I can just say this, that my greatest hope for you, or wish for you in hearing my father's story, is that you feel a sense of hope, that his story is universal, that you can hear about the importance of standing up when you see something wrong or telling somebody in authority, how education and knowing a second language can help you in lifelong ways, and the significance of resilience and perseverance. It's also essential for our survival to know that none of us is alone. We all need to find allies and work to develop those relationships. So that's I think, a good final thing to say.
Thank you so much for all of us.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for your time and for inviting me.
Of course.
Yeah.